Hi, everybody. It's Sunday. I normally do this on Thursday, but this week just got crazy for me. I wanted to talk a little bit about Bosses, Chapter 10, and then Walsh, 8 and 11. And Boss talked about victimization, and of course, that can be a crisis for a lot of people. Some of the examples she used were the Holocaust, civil wars, female sexual victimization, and um, then what occurs with that usually is, or very often, is PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, which we're hearing a lot about these days. So you'll at some point be, I'm sure, have the opportunity to work with people who've been victimized in some way. Of course, the ones that she talked about, Holocaust, Civil War, and things like that, are extreme cases, but things do happen every day in our society where people are victimized. And one of the things that we can do is to help empower our clients, the people we work with, to regain their strength and to come back from um, something like this that happens. At times, people can be immobilized by the victimization. They can feel helpless, hopeless, and they can take a passive position. And so what she's saying for us is that we can help them reclaim their power and to not be passive and to stand up for their rights. And I know sometimes, a lot of times, that's easier said than done. And a lot of times, too, she mentions in here that people blame themselves. I see a lot, and this happens quite often when people are victimized in a relationship, let's say, where there's abuse in a relationship. And very often, I'm sure you've heard the same thing, is that people oftentimes blame themselves for what happened, and their spouse or partner blames them too, and so then they take on that responsibility, and so then a lot of times they feel helpless in the situation. And so for us, it's really important for us to encourage them to not necessarily to blame others or to make somebody else wrong, but to not blame themselves, and because then that perpetuates oftentimes the victim role. Um, because they don't know how to get out of that. And there's such a thing as a chronic threat, where, let's say, go back to the case of violence in the home, victimization in the home, and so you can have inside chronic threat where you never know, you're always just waiting for the other shoe to drop, and thinking that something's going to happen at any time. And then there's outside threat, and I guess where that comes to mind for me is in our society, after 9/11, and we felt so threatened by Al Qaeda and other, countries in the Middle East that may have threatened us, and well, not just the Middle East, other countries too, but so we're always feeling this chronic threat. When we go to the airport and we get checked and we get, all this, there's just this layer of kind of fear that we live in a lot because of this threat that something is going to happen. And so, what we have to do really is to empower ourselves so that we don't live with the threat all the time, or the feeling that brings, which can be very stressful. Um, I had visited with some friends the other day, and one of my friends was talking about her sister, who, and this is a little bit different, but it's an example of empowering people. But this sister of a friend of mine is 60 something years old, and she had gone to the dentist and had to have a couple of teeth pulled and get a bridge. Well, when the doctor got through pulling her teeth, she showed her a mirror, and the person's front tooth was gone. Well, that wasn't one of the teeth that was supposed to be pulled. And she mentioned it. She goes, "Why did you pull my front tooth?" She goes, "Oh, I'm not going to charge you for that one." Well, as it turns out, the doctor had made a mistake, but this friend's sister didn't do anything. She just paid her bill and went on. Well, that's like major to me, somebody pulling your front tooth out. But this person, this 60-something-year-old woman, didn't feel powerful or empowered to go and do something. And we're saying she should sue, or, how can you just let this dentist get away with this? Because if you let it, her get away with it, then, she'll continue. And anyway, so I think a lot of times people don't realize that they can do things, or that they need to do things to uh, take care of the situation. And it's not necessarily just that she should sue so she can make a lot of money, but she should draw attention to this dentist who made such an error like that. So moving into Walsh in chapter 8, she talks about death, loss, and how we deal with that. But she talks about socio-historical like our death, how we've looked at death in the past historically. And I think back, maybe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I only think about that because that's when my grandparents were born and lived. And death, a lot was just, I mean, it is part of life, and we know it's part of life now. But the people died, and babies died, and children died, and men died, and women died in childbirth, and there was just a lot of people dying, and so people. I think they looked at it not as much of a tragedy or a trauma as sometimes we do now. Um, and then she talks about non-symptomatic some people deal with death differently, and so there might be somebody who looks like they're dealing with it really well, but then they really might not be. They're just holding it in. They're dealing with it in a different way from somebody else. So what she's saying, I think, is that we should not just assume that somebody's dealing with something just because they're not really talking about it, or they seem to just be moving on. Some people fall apart. Some families fall apart. Some families come together. But what does happen is when somebody dies in a family, then the family is restructured and reorganized without that person in it. And so let's say, I think I talked last time about a matriarch in the family. Let's say the matriarch dies, then somebody comes in to take her place, so to speak, to take that position of head of the family, so to speak. And so the family reorganizes around that. And sometimes it takes some time for that to happen. People have to deal with their loss and their grief, and then they start reorganizing. The reality of death is sometimes really hard for people. It tends to be really hard for me to think about the reality of somebody being here one day and then just not here the next day and just gone. And I mentioned that my mother is 87 years old, and I was just talking the other day about how just I know that I know that it's going to be really hard for me to deal with that and to go back into my parents' house when my mother's not there, or my father, whichever one goes first. It's just a really odd feeling for me. I've experienced it before, and I know how it feels. Families have a shared experience of death, and so if they stay connected, then it helps people get through usually. And I had a really dear friend die several years ago, and I kept trying to get in touch with her family. I tried to call her mother and her sister, and they didn't want. It was like they wouldn't call me back, and it was almost like they if they didn't talk to me, then they didn't have to deal with the reality of her death. And I did see her mother a few years ago, and I do go from time to time to the gravesite, and her mother said she's never once been after the funeral, and it's been 12 and a half years ago. And so that's just her way of dealing with it. It's not bad or wrong. It's just different. And so I had a hard time staying connected with them, and so I think that made it harder for me. It would have been easier for me to deal with, I think, if I'd been able to stay connected. A lot of times when people lose somebody who's close to them, it's hard for them to open up their heart again to another relationship. And that happens not just with death, but just a loss of a relationship. But once we have a broken heart, it's sometimes hard for us to open back up and to move on. So what she talks about is the timing of the loss is important to think about, the timing in one's life. What the relationship, was it somebody who died way too young or younger, than the normal life expectancy? Was it a sudden death, or was it a chronic illness or a terminal illness that took several years? Is it ambiguous loss? Is it when, like, if somebody has um, Alzheimer's, for instance, they are not there mentally, emotionally, but they're there physically, and so that's ambiguous. Or if somebody's lost at sea, let's say, or a body wasn't found at ground zero, then that's ambiguous because they're gone, but you don't have a body there. So that can be really hard for somebody to deal with loss. If it's unacknowledged or stigmatized, if a family, let's say somebody with HIV/AIDS, somebody dies with AIDS, and their family really never accepted their um, illness, or maybe didn't know about it, and so nobody wants to talk about it because it was AIDS, and there's a stigma attached to that, and so that then makes it hard for the family. If it was a violent death, that can make it really hard. It's important for families, Walsh says this in her book, to make meaning of a loss, to find hope in the future. And a lot of people draw on their spirituality. People will say, well, he or she's in a better place, or it was God's will. Sometimes that makes it easier for people to deal with the loss. And one thing she points out, and I think this is really important too, is the state of the relationship at the time of death. If somebody had a cut off relationship or emotionally challenging relationship with some loved one, and then they lose them, then oftentimes that's really, really hard for them to deal with the loss, because they felt like it was unfinished business, and they just have a hard time letting go and getting past that. We see that a lot. And traumatic events can be really, really hard for people to deal with. I think that when she talks about the Oklahoma City bombings and 9/11, major disasters like hurricanes or the tsunami, when somebody's taken like that, it's really, really hard sometimes for families to ever really move past a traumatic loss like that. And I've been to the Oklahoma City Memorial, and it's very, very touching to see. They have chairs. I don't know if any of y'all have ever had the opportunity to go, but chairs for all the people, with the names of all the people who were lost, including little chairs for the kids. It's very emotional, but people oftentimes have to have things like that in order for them to be able to have some closure, just so they feel like the person's being honored. Anyway, so this is kind of a depressing topic to be talking about, but it's what we're studying this semester. So anyway, I will see y'all next time.